At dawn that morning, on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an aircraft took off carrying something that had never existed in human history. Inside the bomb bay, it was still incomplete, the detonator removed, the firing mechanism held back, nothing more than a block of metal carrying a promise of destruction. This was a deliberate choice, because if the bomb had been fully assembled on the ground, a single malfunction during takeoff could have turned the entire base into ashes and buried 3 years of secrecy in a matter of seconds. And so an unprecedented decision was made. The Day of Judgment would be assembled after the aircraft had left the runway, when the ocean lay below and the risk was pushed away from those left behind, until amid the vibrating fuselage and thin sheets of metal, a silent action took place, a moment around which all of the history that followed would be forced to revolve. In the summer of 1945, World War II had reached its end in terms of time, yet it had also reached its highest threshold of destruction. In Europe, Nazi Germany had surrendered, the fronts had fallen silent, and columns of troops were beginning to return home carrying a sense of victory mixed with exhaustion. Yet, on the other side of the globe, in Asia and the Pacific, the war continued at a very different pace. The Imperial Japanese Army kept fighting more out of an instinct for survival than strategic calculation, prepared to sacrifice everything to prolong the conflict. That contrast placed the United States and the Allied powers before a dilemma with few acceptable options. An invasion of the Japanese home islands was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and unleash a slaughter unprecedented in modern history. In that context, another option gradually came into view, not as a more humane solution, but as a decisive way out: the use of a weapon powerful enough to end the war with a single blow. That weapon was the atomic bomb, the most closely guarded product of the Manhattan Project, the largest scientific and military program ever undertaken in wartime. Beginning in 1942, at Los Alamos Laboratory, some of the world's leading scientists worked in absolute secrecy under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer. There were no public announcements, no spectacular test runs, only equations on paper and blocks of metal shaped in silence under relentless pressure from the clock. By mid-1945, that effort had crystallized into the first 2 atomic bombs in human history. One was named Little Boy, using uranium in a gun-type mechanism. The other was Fat Man, powered by plutonium with a far more complex implosion design. Between the 2 designs, Little Boy was considered the preferred option for the first strike. Its long, cylindrical shape concealed a simple but brutal principle. A hollow projectile of uranium-235 would be driven by explosive force into a solid uranium target, triggering an extremely powerful nuclear fission chain reaction. This design had never been tested in real conditions, yet scientists judged it reliable enough to be used directly in war. Once that decision was made, the most important question was no longer whether the bomb would work, but how to deliver such a weapon of destruction to its target safely and accurately without causing an unintended catastrophe before it was released. The answer lay on a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Tinian Island. There, the US military built North Field, a massive airbase with runways long enough to serve B-29 superfortresses. Beneath layers of coral dust and concrete, Tinian became more than a launch point for strategic bombing missions. It turned into the logistical center for the most extraordinary operation of the war. Facilities that had never existed before were constructed almost from scratch. Reinforced bomb assembly buildings and deep bomb pits dug into the ground, designed to handle and lift weapons weighing nearly 5 tons into aircraft bomb bays with maximum safety. Alongside this infrastructure, people were chosen with equal care. A secret unit known as Project Alberta was formed, bringing together more than 50 elite military and civilian specialists, all volunteers for a mission whose risks they fully understood. This unit was divided into 2 parallel lines of work. Responsibility for Fat Man fell to Norris Bradbury, who focused on the complex design and plutonium-related testing. Meanwhile, the team handling Little Boy operated under Francis Birch, directly responsible for the bomb intended to be used first. From July 945 onward, the entire group was stationed on Tinian, working in silence, racing against time and weather, preparing for a moment they all understood would leave the world forever changed. By late July 1945, Tinian no longer resembled an ordinary airbase. The atmosphere on the small island grew heavy with anticipation. The war appeared to be entering its final chapter, yet for those within Project Alberta, each passing day felt like a relentless sprint. Even without an official order from Washington specifying targets or timing, the work on Tinian could not slow for a single hour. Everything had to be ready before the final decision was made. Successive versions of Little Boy were repeatedly assembled, disassembled, and inspected down to every detail, then tested in the only way possible without touching the nuclear core. Engineers used dummy bombs, commonly known as pumpkin bombs, which closely matched the real weapon in size and weight, but contained no uranium at all. These were hung beneath B-29 superfortresses and dropped on offshore practice targets, allowing crews to evaluate aircraft stability, bomb release mechanisms, and fall trajectories under real operational conditions. On the 31st of July 1945, that tension reached its peak when the Enola Gay, flown by Paul Tibbets, carried out a full dress rehearsal. It was the first time the entire sequence was simulated almost in its entirety, from takeoff and long-range flight to target approach and bomb release, missing only one element, the actual explosion. The rehearsal went smoothly, and for those watching closely, it was both a reassuring sign and a stark reminder that an irreversible moment was drawing near. Just days earlier, on July 25, General Karl Spaatz had received instructions from above. Strategic bombing forces were to be ready to use the atomic weapon in early August, with Hiroshima designated as the top priority target. From that point on, every activity on Tinian took on a different meaning. Inside the reinforced assembly pits, the real Little Boy, the 11th version, and the most refined of them all, was placed in readiness, awaiting orders. From a technical standpoint, nearly everything was prepared. Only the weather and the final political decision remained. It was precisely at this moment, when everything seemed to be falling into place, that a serious concern suddenly emerged. In less than a week before the scheduled mission, 4 B-29 seconds had crashed and burned on the runways at Tinian during takeoff. These incidents caused no major loss of life, but they sent a shock through the entire command structure. The question arose immediately. What would happen if one of those accidents involved an aircraft carrying an atomic bomb? The answer was chilling. A single skid on the runway, an engine explosion, or a tire blowout at high speed could trigger the bomb while still on the ground. With an explosive yield equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT, Little Boy would not only destroy the entire Northfield base, but could also cause casualties among tens of thousands of American troops stationed on Tinian. Such a disaster would erase not just a base, but the entire secret nuclear program the United States had spent 3 years building. Several emergency options were discussed, including the idea of evacuating most personnel from the island during takeoff. In reality, however, this was almost impossible to carry out within such a short time frame and on such a large scale. In the end, commanders reached a cold but logical conclusion. To eliminate the risk of catastrophe on the ground, the bomb had to be kept from a fully armed state when the aircraft left the runway. From that reasoning, an unprecedented decision was made. Little Boy would be loaded onto the Enola Gay without its propellant charge and detonators. The final arming process would take place only after the aircraft was airborne, over the open ocean, where the risk could be pushed far away from the base and American forces. That decision meant that the lives of the entire flight crew and the safety of the entire mission were placed in the hands of a single man. The task was assigned to William Parsons, a U.S. Navy captain, a veteran weapons officer of the Manhattan Project, and the weaponeer aboard the Enola Gay. He would be required to carry out something no one had ever done before, turning an inert block of metal into a functioning nuclear weapon while the aircraft was in flight. In the early hours of the 6th of August 1945, the plan was set in motion. Under dim lights at the bomb pit, Little Boy was slowly lifted by crane and installed into the bomb bay of the Enola Gay, still in an unarmed state. At 1:45 a.m., Tibbets started the 4 engines. By 2:45 a.m., the heavy B-29 left the runway, carrying 12 crew members and the weapon that would change history, heading northwest toward Japan. Just minutes after the aircraft reached a safe altitude over the open ocean, Parsons began the most critical task of his life. He removed his flak vest and squeezed through the narrow passage into the dark bomb bay, where the more than 3-meter-long little boy lay silent amid the gentle vibration of the aircraft. The space was cramped, the steady roar of the engines filled the air, and every movement had to be exact. A single mistake here could kill the entire crew and leave catastrophe in its wake. With the assistance of First Lieutenant Morris Jepson, responsible for electronic weapons systems, Parsons opened the bomb casing and began inserting the nitrocellulose propellant charge into the gun assembly. This charge would drive the uranium projectile into the target, triggering the nuclear fission reaction. He then carefully installed the detonators and the electrical components required for the firing system. No one spoke. Time seemed to stretch inside the cold metal compartment. After a little more than 20 minutes, Parsons completed the most critical steps. Little Boy was now almost fully assembled, yet it remained in a safe condition, with its fuses and firing circuits not yet fully connected. Parsons and Jepson left the bomb bay, breathing a quiet sigh of relief. The most dangerous phase was over. The first atomic bomb in human history had been assembled while in flight. The Enola Gay continued on through the thinning darkness, its engines steadily carrying it toward the target chosen before takeoff. As the first light of morning appeared on the horizon, the atmosphere inside the aircraft began to shift. The earlier silence gave way to a low, persistent tension, the kind that settles in when everyone understands there is no turning back. The weather that day was exceptionally favorable, with clear skies and visibility stretching for tens of kilometers, ideal conditions for a visual bombing mission. It was precisely within that seemingly calm setting, around 7 a.m., as the aircraft approached Japanese airspace, that William Parsons carried out the final action. He removed the remaining safety plugs and inserted the red arming plugs into the bomb casing, closing the firing circuit. From that moment on, Little Boy was no longer a technical device awaiting completion, but a weapon of destruction in a fully armed state. Only then did Paul Tibbets formally inform the entire crew of the true nature of what they were carrying. Even though everyone understood the extraordinary nature of the mission, the confirmation still brought a brief silence to the cockpit. Each man knew they were moving toward a moment that had never before existed in human history. The morning of the 6th of August, 1945, passed quietly below, over Hiroshima. The city had just come out of a false air raid alert after an American weather reconnaissance aircraft departed without an attack. Many believed the danger had passed, but at 8:15 a.m., at an altitude of approximately 9,600 meters, the Enola Gay appeared over the city. The bombardier reported that the target was directly below, and Tibbets silently nodded, tightening his grip on the controls. The bomb bay doors opened, and Little Boy dropped free from the aircraft, beginning its fall. Almost simultaneously, the Enola Gay made a sharp turn, increased speed, and raced away from the area to create distance. 43 seconds later, a blinding flash erupted behind them, brighter than anything human eyes had ever seen. The bomb detonated in the air over Hiroshima, releasing energy equivalent to roughly 15 kilotons of TNT. The entire city convulsed. A massive fireball formed, temperatures at the center soaring to over 1 million degrees Celsius, incinerating the air and everything nearby. The characteristic mushroom cloud surged upward thousands of meters, visible from tens of kilometers away. Aboard the Enola Gay, 2 shock waves arrived in succession, slamming into the aircraft. When the crew looked back, they saw Hiroshima engulfed in flames. In that instant, they understood they had just created a terrifying turning point in history. The consequences appeared swiftly and brutally. Nearly the entire central area of Hiroshima was flattened, with structures within a radius of roughly 2 to 3 kilometers from the hypocenter completely destroyed. An estimated 80,000 people were killed instantly, and more than 100,000 others were seriously injured, numbers that would continue to rise in the months that followed due to radiation exposure. A city of approximately 350,000 people was nearly erased in a single moment, yet even that shock was not enough to bring the war to an immediate end. 3 days later, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Only then did the Japanese imperial court move toward a decision to end the conflict. On the 15th of August 1945, the Emperor of Japan announced surrender to the Allies, and World War II officially came to a close, leaving behind a turning point that humanity would continue to confront and debate for generations to come. When looking back at the moment little boy detonated over the skies of Hiroshima, what haunts people is not only the scale of destruction or the casualty figures recorded afterward, but how close history itself had come to catastrophe even before the bomb was released. To this day, the bombing remains one of the most deeply contested events of the 20th century, an episode for which no single answer exists and no verdict has ever been sufficient to end the debate. What few realize is that the entire atomic age once stood on an extraordinarily fragile edge. A single accident on the runway at Tinian, a decision made a few minutes earlier or later, and the disaster could have unfolded in an entirely different place, involving entirely different people, before the world had any chance to understand what was being created. The decision to assemble and arm the bomb in mid-air was neither an act of heroism nor merely a technical maneuver. It was a choice made in circumstances where every option carried consequences that could not be reversed. Inside the cramped bomb bay of the Enola Gay, as the final steps were carried out, there was no sense of victory and no declaration of defeat, only the silence of people who understood they were taking part in a moment beyond the control of any single individual. From that point on, the question was no longer whether the bomb would detonate, but how humanity would live with its consequences. The journey from Tinian Island to the skies over Hiroshima therefore became more than a military mission. It marked the moment humanity crossed an invisible threshold. The atomic age did not begin with a proclamation, but with a series of quiet decisions, where science, war, and human fate converged within a space so confined it was almost suffocating. History moved forward from there in its own way, leaving future generations not with a conclusion, but with a question that remains unanswered. When humanity holds the power of absolute destruction, what truly defines responsibility, and who has the right to make the final decision?